So just explain what automatic priority need is. I'm now going to look at this idea of vulnerability, which, as I say, that's the most complicated part, I would say, of the kind of the 5-part test. And that isn't to say that it's not possible to understand it. So don't kind of get discouraged and think, oh, I've got no way of ever understanding this. It is possible to understand it, but it does require some careful thinking about it, because it's essentially there's layers to it, is how I'd probably say it. And so I'll try and go through this video and kind of build up these layers, which will hopefully give you a reasonable understanding of what it means. The first thing to say, I would say, is that vulnerability within housing law means something very specific. So you may well be working with people who are classed as vulnerable adults by adult social care or other sectors, health and whatever. That does not equate to vulnerability within housing law. It almost certainly does mean that, but it's kind of, so someone who would be classed as a vulnerable adult almost certainly would be in priority needs through vulnerability, but it's not a given. You'd have to do the homework to actually show why that is. And so what I'll do is to try and explain it, is I'll go through a kind of a series of cases, 3 cases, which I'd say kind of give us a ballpark understanding of what vulnerability means. Starting in 2015, so basically there's a big case, went to the Supreme Court, known by the term HOTAC, which is simply one of the guys that was involved in the case. And in that case, the judge basically said, I'm paraphrasing, but the judge basically said, if someone is significantly more vulnerable than an ordinary, healthy and robust person, if they became homeless, then they would be vulnerable and therefore in priority need. So that was a big step forward from the previous case law. It's a real kind of positive move, but it's still very, very ambiguous, I would say. So what does significantly mean? What does ordinary mean? You can go to the Oxford Dictionary definition, and it kind of talks about significantly meaning more than trivial, makes a consequential difference, all those kind of things. And ordinary would simply be something that's not worthy of note. So essentially, most people in England are ordinary people, in terms of, certainly from the terms of point of housing law, in that there's nothing really that would kind of be a risk factor if they were to become homeless. Most people, if they became homeless today, would have friends and family who could support them, would have money in the bank to kind of pay for accommodation. They'd have options, basically. They'd have resilience, they'd have mental resilience in order to kind of help them deal with the consequences of homelessness. That's ordinary people. But there are also people who, through disabilities, mental health issues, physical disabilities, kind of history being in care, history being in the armed forces, all those kind of things, that means that they're not as resilient effectively. They don't have support network and all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of ballpark what we're talking about here. So then in 2017, there was a case which was known as Smithfield Harangay, and essentially the wording of that judgment has ended up in the Code of Guidance. So in one sense, if you're going to argue someone's vulnerable, this is probably the best place to get it from, or the best kind of wording to use. I wouldn't say it's the clearest, but it is the one in the Code of Guidance, so it probably does hold the most legal weight. And essentially in that case, the judge said, and I'm just going to read off my page here, and I'm paraphrasing again, but the question to be asked, said the judge, is whether, when compared to an ordinary person, the applicant would suffer harm that would make a noticeable difference to his ability to deal with homelessness, which the ordinary person would not. So that's a fairly even when I try and kind of paraphrase it, that's still a fairly wordy way of saying it. But what I'd say is you can kind of boil this kind of definition down to a 3-part test, which I always call the Smith test, but it's not called that anywhere else as far as I know. But essentially, so the first question is, what harm would this person suffer if they became homeless, or if they were threatened with homelessness, let's say. So that's the kind of first question. So that may be, maybe they've got arthritis, and sleeping on the streets is going to mean that their joints kind of seize up, they experience more pain or whatever. That would be a fairly straightforward kind of case. Maybe it's that they've got depression, and that depression might worsen to a point where they start self-harming or just not functioning, or kind of even risk of suicide, those kind of things. So that would be kind of that would be the harm that this individual would suffer. The next question to ask is, well, would an ordinary, healthy and robust person suffer this harm? So that's the second part. So in one sense, homelessness law kind of acknowledges that if anyone became homeless, it's going to be a very distressing situation, and you're going to undergo some harm. It's going to be a horrible experience, whatever. But as I say, most people would have the support network and the resources in order to deal with it. Stressful though it is, they are going to be able to get themselves back on their feet fairly quickly. And then the third one, and this is kind of what it all hinges on, would the harm that you've identified in number one, would that make a noticeable difference to their ability to deal with homelessness? So, for example, that example is somebody's got, significant depression, and homelessness is likely to make that depression worsen to a point where actually they are no longer able to manage their affairs. They're just not able to get out and about to, source accommodation. They just, they don't, they can't face dealing with it all, or they can't deal with it in a positive way, let's say in a constructive way. Then I would say you've kind of satisfied the three part of this test, and so they would be vulnerable. And again, this is very clumsy, but this is just kind of give you a ballpark understanding of it. Then the third kind of the definition, or the third kind of case I'm going to talk about, is a situation which I would say does kind of outline it more clearly than the Smith v Harangay case, and that was Thomas v Lamberth. It was also 2017. I think it only went to the county court, so I'm not a lawyer, but I think that means that it doesn't hold as much weight as the Smith one would, or the Hotak one, which went to the Supreme Court. But essentially in that case, so Miss Thomas was a lady with depression and anxiety, some risk of suicidal ideation and kind of other things. And basically her GP wrote a really clear, detailed letter about what is likely to happen to her if she was to become homeless. And so out of it, there's a lot to say about this case, but out of it, the judge in that case said that you can kind of boil it down to three questions. So the first one is, does the person have an identified existing issue? So in Ms. Thomas's case, it was her mental health. That was the identified existing issue. But it could be anything that's listed in the Homelessness Act 2002. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but essentially that kind of talks about, people who've been in the armed forces, people who've been in care, people who are fleeing domestic abuse, people who are subject to modern slavery, people who are kind of institutionalized in prison. There's probably some others I missed out. And crucially, there's this other special reason, which basically what that's saying is that the list is not exhaustive. You can have some people who are vulnerable, but they don't kind of fit any of those criteria. So it's kind of something else. So an example of this I kind of tend to use in our online training is that, it's acknowledged that being in care may well be traumatic and may well lead someone to be in priority need down the line, later in life. But there's plenty of kids who essentially are neglected and abused, and for whatever reason, they're never removed into care. So in one sense, there's some research around this which says that actually children removed into care often kind of fare better than those that shouldn't, that were on the cusp of being removed into care but weren't. So, you might have someone who was known to children's services, there's kind of subject to child protection and child in need kind of stuff, all that sort of stuff. That would be potentially another special reason, so that would be something that you would potentially look at. And, childhood trauma, childhood neglect is a common theme within people accessing homelessness services, particularly those who kind of go round and round in circles. That often they'll kind of get picked up in other ways as well. So potentially they might be known to mental health services because they might have certain mental health diagnoses like borderline personality disorder or whatever. But that's the kind of stuff you want to be looking at. So number one, does the person have an identified existing issue? Yep. Would the consequences of that issue be significantly exacerbated by the threat of homelessness? So for example, let's use this kind of simple example again. So someone's got serious arthritis, that's the identified existing issue. Would the consequences of that issue be significantly exacerbated by the threat of homelessness? Well, one of the consequences of the issue of arthritis would be significant pain. And if you were to be sleeping on a cold concrete floor and have nowhere warm to kind of rest in the day, I'm not a medic, but I'm guessing that that's going to make your arthritis much worse, which means you're going to struggle to get around. You're going to experience significant pain, even more than you would be already. So yes, that would be significantly exacerbated. And then thirdly, would the exacerbation of the issue lead to a risk of harm? So in the arthritis example, the pain in itself is a harm that it would lead to a risk of. So in one sense, you're almost crossing both questions out in one go. It may be that maybe the identified existing issue is depression, as in Miss Thomas's case. The risk that was identified in the GP is that the depression would be exacerbated by homelessness, and that would lead to the risk of harm in form of self-harm, risk of suicide, that kind of thing. So again, that's if you hit all three of those kind of parts of the question, you're working with someone who's in priority need. So when we write to a GP or a social worker or whoever that is in contact with the person we're supporting, those three questions that I essentially use the Thomas test, that kind of three-part question from Thomas, to ask the question to the GP. Do they have an identified existing issue? What's likely to happen to them if they were to become homeless? Would there be a risk of harm that arises from that? Often GPs are, have plenty of information at hand to kind of answer those questions in some detail. Again, I'll kind of say more about this on our Introduction to Homelessness or training course online. So that's kind of, that's we've got a long way now to understanding priority need a little bit better, hopefully, our vulnerability. There is another kind of issue that comes into it as well, and that is that people with disabilities. Now, having a disability does not mean that you are automatically vulnerable, but you probably are. If you've got an impairment which is having a substantial impact on your day-to-day living activities, it's likely there aren't going to be too many people with disabilities which are not going to be made worse by homelessness. So that's kind of the question, really. So, and again, so under the Equality Act, councils have a duty to basically be very, very careful in considering people who have a disability. Interestingly, most housing officers I know have never been trained on it, so they're really going to struggle to understand what their duties are. But they should understand what a disability is, and they should understand how they then need to consider that throughout the process of dealing with a homeless application. So I think there's a lot more to say about it. There's a whole load of stuff from case law around substance use and kind of lots of stuff that could be said, which we do cover in our online training. But that hopefully is kind of giving you a starting point. Again, next job for you to do if you want to get your head around it is read Chapter 8 of the Code of Guidance, because that's where it all kind of happens. And potentially, again, nearlylegal.co.uk. It's a blog run by Giles Peaker. If you I think that you can kind of search for homelessness cases, and out of that you'll see a really good exposition of these kind of cases around vulnerability. So, for example, even if you search for Thomas V Lamberth Nearly Legal, I'm almost certain the blog will come straight up, and you can kind of read not only kind of an exposition of the case, but then you kind of get Giles Peaker's summary of it, which he's fantastic. So it's really kind of worth subscribing to his blog as well. It's just a really kind of good source of current information. But yeah, that's kind of vulnerability, or certainly a stab at explaining it. We'll now look at local connection and intentional homelessness. Again, please like the video, share it and stuff, because this information gets people housed. We've seen so many ridiculous cases where obviously vulnerable people are getting told they're not in priority needs, and it's because councils get away with it because no one's holding them to account. No one's taken the time to understand the law to actually argue with them. I remember in Bedford a few years ago now, we had a guy vulnerable for a number of reasons already, became homeless, tried to take his own life, ended up in an inpatient unit. Was the consultant psychiatrist gave a really, really kind of clear view on what's going to happen to this guy if he was to become homeless. The council essentially, I don't know what they did with it. They said he was non-priority. He was homeless. He kind of said to him, look, I feel suicidal because I'm homeless, and they recorded that he said that, didn't do anything about it, and he tried to kill himself again. It wasn't until it got referred to us after the second time in psychiatric unit that we were able to kind of challenge that decision. But things like that happen all the time, So in one sense, it's not even that kind of those ones which are on the borderline of vulnerability are kind of not picked up. There are extreme cases. There's a whole load we got from Bedford Borough Council where they just, I can't, I don't know how you could justify what they're doing. But anyway, so yeah, check out the next video. I'll see you in a minute.